the humanities at the University of Brighton was under the same kind of threat that we heard in a previous session about what universities are for, that Salford was under. And Salford, we heard, reinvented the courses that were under threat there in order to survive. That's also something that happened here at the University of Brighton in respect of humanities. Now, we thought it would be useful to have a specific talk about the humanities under threat, not just because of the current threat to humanities with the cut in funding, and nor because we wanted to engage in some kind of backslapping narcissism of our own that might end up being hubris of some kind, but because perhaps by looking at some specific cases, we could get some angle or some edge or some handle on what responses to the current threats to the universities might be. To that end, Gill Scott, who has been, for most of the years that the BA Humanities program has been operating since it went through a refashioning in order to survive, has agreed to give a brief talk about that program, how it emerged, and its character.
Thank you. Is the sound all right? Can you hear me? Can anyone not hear me? I'm sorry to keep you waiting. I was confused about the time, and it just made me think of the fact that back in October, in the new academic year, I was slightly late for a lecture, and one of the first-year students waiting for me said, "I've paid £9,000 for this education. How are you going to make up the time that I've lost?" So I said, well, I'll make the lecture longer. Is that all right? But anyway, I'm sorry for being late. As you're probably aware, and you've just been told, one of the prompts for this event is the 25th anniversary of the Humanities programme that is taught here at Brighton University. And really, as Tom was just saying, what we want to mark here is the fact that this programme has survived and has indeed thrived for a quarter of a century, although in the 1980s, it faced extinction. So the programme that we now deliver only exists because from that protracted period of crisis in the 1980s, an opportunity was seized to create an ambitious new programme. So, of course, the key point here is that the neoliberal assault on higher education is not new. In the 1980s, with the Thatcher government in its second term of office, drastic cuts in public spending underway, and Keith Joseph as Education Secretary looking for retrenchment in higher education, the Humanities Department at Brighton Polytechnic, as was marked for closure. Teaching provision in history, philosophy, English, and so on, in what was then a combined studies programme, was deemed to have no vocational value and therefore to be inappropriate for a polytechnic. That initial decision to close the department was overturned by a vigorous campaign to save the humanities. That campaign included the union, NATFE then, but it also involved a wider, more public mobilisation with letters to the press, support from MPs, etc. All of that did win a reprieve, but the threat did not go away. Student numbers were falling, staff were not being replaced, and the axe still hovered. What, as colleagues were saying earlier, what was to be done? A small group of politically astute colleagues began to think about ways of making the degree A, more attractive to students for recruitment purposes, and B, less vulnerable to death by salami slicing cuts. Those colleagues had a number of priorities: to defend jobs and courses, to preserve and strengthen a critical humanities education worth the name, and also to try and ensure that access to such provision should be as wide as possible. Above all, they wanted to make sure that the whole lot should be as durable and as resilient as possible. And so those colleagues went forth. They undertook research, they conferred, they produced drafts, they conferred. They made important decisions, and fueled, I dare say, by industrial quantities of black coffee and vodka, they came up with a radically new degree, the original BA Humanities. There's a list of degrees down there which includes still the name, the BA Humanities, but the whole idea for that and what frames those awards originated in this degree that was eventually validated successfully in 1987 and recruited its first cohort in 1988, 25 years ago. And so the reason we are all here today is that, marking this 25-year event, is that the model that those colleagues invented, which was a synthesis of interdisciplinarity, non-modular delivery, with a pedagogic emphasis on small groups and the development of student research and other intellectual skills. That model works so well that it still defines what we do. So I want to look a bit more closely at the founding and enduring principles that they came up with. Interdisciplinarity. That entailed a reconfiguration of an existing combined studies programme. In place of small and exposed subject groups offering joint honours, multidisciplinary if you like, instead of that, the provision was integrated. Colleagues were connected through team-authored and team-taught courses. Interdisciplinarity offered prospective undergraduates a distinctive educational experience. A first year of compulsory single discipline units with a methodological focus in philosophy, history, cultural studies, and so forth. In the 1990s, that was supplemented by a compulsory history of ideas course delivered in year 2 called Critical Traditions in Western Thought. But then in the second and third years, students also followed an interdisciplinary option that draws on 2 or more subjects to examine a theme arising from some contemporary world issue. Titles such as Self and Society, Culture and Conflict, Fictions in History. And alongside that, each student undertakes a research project with one-to-one supervision. Students receive guidance in framing their proposals for their projects, but they're encouraged to formulate their own research question, which goes some ways towards offsetting the relative lack of choice in regard to the options that they take. So there was an interdisciplinary approach to delivering the degree, the BA Humanities. But the innovation of interdisciplinarity by itself would not have met the proliferating challenges of the 1980s. Modularity was being rolled out in answer to growing student-staff ratios and also to enhance student choice, the idea of a marketplace where you choose things. The new humanities degree explicitly bucked that trend with an entirely non-modular developmental structure that prioritized depth over breadth and gave students the chance to develop as thinkers. Now, as then, the courses we teach are developmental as well as interdisciplinary. Course units are not written as stand-alone modules, but to be delivered, not written as stand-alone modules to be delivered in a single term or semester, but as elements, as parts of a larger journey, building on what came before and preparing students for what follows. For these reasons, students remain in the same option group through the second and third year, gaining familiarity with one another alongside a common fund of knowledge and analytical skills. This interdisciplinary and non-modular structure was underpinned by an academic rationale for the provision that is as important now as it was in winning the case for the humanities in the 1980s. The 80s saw the rise of a skills agenda that still views arts and humanities as irrelevant to the job market. The subversive response of colleagues in the 1980s was to insist that humanities had always been about transferable intellectual skills. Research was undertaken and papers delivered at conferences by these colleagues to demonstrate that employers want graduates who know how to think analytically and critically, how to contextualize ideas and information, how to synthesize and summarize material effectively. That idea of transferable intellectual skills was built into the design of the course and was effective in fortifying the new degree against skills agenda critics on various fronts, including the validation panel. But that talk of transferable skills isn't just about winning an argument, it works. In the words of one student to me in a tutorial, he said, "What I'm learning here is not what to think, but how to think." Another important transferable skill, of course, is communication, in writing, but also in speech. The emphasis on verbal communication as a transferable and by implication demonstrable skill is linked to the most distinctive feature of this programme, which is oral assessment. Discussion and debate, the critical exchange of views, the presentation, defence or interrogation of arguments through seminar work, all of that's always been central to a lot of higher education teaching, particularly the humanities. Yet many colleagues in higher education are familiar with the experience of sitting around a table with a predominantly silent group of students who are unprepared or unwilling to share their knowledge or admit to the lack of it. On one such occasion, here at Brighton back in the 80s, as the tutor took the group to task for their lack of preparation for a seminar discussion, one student answered him, "But seminars don't count." From that remark came the resolve to make seminars count. Oral assessment, in the form of the weekly assessment of each student's participation in every seminar, right through the degree, with a formal oral examination as part of final assessment, all of that was written into the new degree in 1987-8 and has been practiced ever since. Crucially, oral assessment requires that the maximum size of seminar groups is kept at 12, which built in protection against the damaging impact of increasing class sizes. As well as capping the size of seminar groups at 12, pre- and post-essay tutorial provision was also built into the new humanities degree and continues to be part of what we provide. But inevitably, that means less contact time if you focus only on the quantity of the contact and disregard the size of the groups in which contact takes place. And we've always insisted, we continue to insist, that what is lost in terms of quantity of contact time is made up for in terms of the quality of that contact. Although I have to say that's a difficult piece of information to insert into the new KISS data that we have to fill in. So, we have this distinctive academic programme aimed at students from the widest possible background. From the beginning, we had close relationships with access courses. We actually did borrow from the structures and the pedagogy of access provision. And we've always encouraged applications from access students and adult learners more generally. In terms of admissions policy, we do not offer places without an interview. Applicants need to understand what is on offer, and we need to get a sense of how they will take to the oral assessment regime. The emphasis on interviewing, now increasingly rare in higher education, makes it easier for us to identify students who would benefit from this programme, but who have so far underperformed or been marginalised by mainstream education. Now, rather than just trying to describe all this, I want to show a clip from a video that was made a couple of years ago to help us prepare for recruitment in the new cold climate of the fees hike, which began last year. Our filmmaker spent a week roaming around the building, talking to students, and with their permission, filming what he saw. Because it is unscripted and unrehearsed, it captures some of the experiences of teaching and learning on the programme and the experience that students have far more effectively than I can do descriptively. It's a 15-minute video, but I'm only going to show a section from the middle of it.
To be effective interlocutors, to deploy an argument convincingly, to win an audience to a position.
So my reading of Brzezinski, he actually describes the US-Soviet rivalry as a conflict between two imperial powers, which does put it more into the intra-systemic between the same systems sort of competing, albeit with...
Well, it's not something they would be able to just stop the nuclear arms race unless it covered the entirety of the world.
It's also September the 1st, involvement of US warships and Marines in Lebanon. In September and October, US invasion of Grenada on October the 25th, and then intensified pressure on Nicaragua.
22, as did North.
The Humanities course is actually very unique in its style of teaching. In the seminars, we never have a seminar of more than 12 people. It's a rule because it's a very close-knit group, and obviously throughout the year we get to know each other very well, and the whole point of the seminar is like interaction-based. It's like a discussion group.
Every aspect.
Then again, I believe devil's advocate, you could argue that perhaps with a state direction you actually invent useful things as opposed to completely irrelevant and useless things such as we have in the West that are just completely...
Only achieve the
I
direction
could go down the high street and buy a million things that are useless and irrelevant.
Why are they relevant?
Consumers demand them, why are they relevant?
Yeah, if people want them, why?
Pardon? Consumers don't demand them, so all this business is about business.
Hang on.
I think you're talking about getting it
But you all started off making a point about the possibility of critical thought, and that being necessary in some very broad sense for human progress, I think. And then you got into a bit of a cat fight about the value of the market. It's all relative.
Mark's my supervisor, and I'm doing. This is the sort of title at the moment.
Gill said,
In situations of extreme colonialism, is it justified to use violence? Something like that.
Now, if you remember your theory, of course, every sign is composed of two aspects, a signifier and a signified. The image, or the word, or the object, or the sound which is standing in for something else is the signifier. So we have a photograph here of Ryan Giggs. It's not Ryan Giggs, it's a photograph of Ryan Giggs. So the photo here is the signifier for this sign. The signified is to what this is referring. So what does it mean to think about Ryan Giggs as a sign? Now, you may or may not have noticed that signs of Ryan Giggs, pictures of him, were splashed across all of the front pages of all of the mainstream newspapers yesterday. What kind of work was the image of Ryan Giggs doing for these papers? How did the different images that were chosen by the different papers secure particular kinds of meanings over other kinds of meanings?
I think what I've learned here is just not to accept things anymore. Because, I mean, this is I think that's the main thing. Like, before coming here, and I would read the newspaper and I thought, yeah, interesting. And now I go like, "Rawr!" So I don't want this. The crowd.
But that's really natural.
The first, and obviously, again, following on from the last lecture, globalisation is multidimensional. Some writers argue that economic globalisation, which is as a key aspect of it, is doing real harm to the environment. Global environmental movement, it's spread, it's not just a northern phenomenon now. There are southern environmental movements, they're connected with their northern counterparts. It's part of the growth of global civil society. So this is us as citizens. We are joining NGOs, civil society organisations, and thinking and acting in a more cosmopolitan manner, and that aids the environment, is the argument.
My view, they kind of cocked up the country quite massively.
Yeah, that too.
We could ask Gill about her view, it'd be quite nice to go, actually.
Yeah.
You've got lots of ideas of your own.
Yeah? You sure you don't want to give a perspective of New Labour?
So my name's Woody Ledderber. I'm a third year humanities student. Tomorrow I'm about to perform my final oral presentation, which is the summation of the whole course. It's the final module really, and it's the 10% of your course, and after tomorrow it's all over. And my project is about the circumstances behind the creation of the atom bomb in the Manhattan Project. At the moment I'm quite nervous, so that's sort of driving me to make sure that in my preparation that it's hopefully flawless, and after lots of practice, hopefully that sort of nerves will be able to dissipate.
We offer interdisciplinary degrees in the humanities, and that goes against the way higher education has gone, which is to offer single discipline courses. And we've got a very simple principle. If you're studying the humanities and you want to understand the world that human beings live in, then you need to be able to see that world from a variety of different perspectives in order to interrogate the assumptions that any one discipline makes. And the second principle, I guess, is that we're trying to defend degrees which are academic, first and foremost, as opposed to degrees which are simply about getting a job. Now, that doesn't mean students can't use the skills they learn to do work, but it's our belief that it's very, very important that when students come to university, they're not doing job training. Doing a university degree is not the same as doing job training. What we offer them is we try and open their worlds. Those three things: interdisciplinarity, and academic training, and work in seminars which are never bigger than 12, so that everybody learns to participate and interact.
Which is the Cold War, which is the wider political situation, yes. Then you say elevated its significance to unparalleled levels in what McNamara calls the fog of war. Now, fog is the right word. We're in a bit of a fog because we don't know precisely how you're going to narrow this down in order to discuss it and develop it. If we sort of unpack these points and inserted a sentence which captures a bit of the significance of McNamara's intervention when it happened, what he was looking back on, and crucially, who McNamara was in relation to the Vietnam War.
Yeah, in terms of supervision, it's actually an extremely relaxed environment too, and you know, you can approach your supervisors really easily. It's not as hierarchical, and here you just go and you knock on your supervisor's door, and people are happy to discuss.
Have you done any searching? I mean, is there anything coming out that you've found already?
On Dawson Era, I'm reading a book called The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, and that's from like 2003 or something, and it was talking about the textile revolution to overthrow the corruption of the government and how quick that spread.
I think that there's some work to do on these aims, and I think that the second one, for example, to determine the conditions for a revolution, doesn't really do the job. I mean, what you might be interested in focusing is the relationship between new communications media and the democracy movements.
Yeah.
Many institutions, they receive the UCAS form, they look and they see if the predicted grades are 3As, and if they are 3As, then they offer a place, or 3Bs, or whatever the requirements are. We don't do that. We interview every student, and the reason for doing that, it goes back to the original principles. We want to know the students, but we also want the students to be aware of what it is we expect from them when they come onto the degree. So it's as much about them getting a sense of what they're letting themselves in for. They need to know that there's nowhere to hide. They need to know that they'll have to participate.
Yeah, I really like what you put here actually, that about Khalil saying that he added that with the downfall of communism, it wasn't democracy that had won, it was capitalism.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there's lots of theories and stuff, but nothing seems to actually work, does it? There's always seems to be some kind of conflict, some kind of like somebody's being oppressed somewhere.
Careful when you use them. I think that you can make them because you risk making generalisations that make assumptions about things that you don't necessarily take in figures. Well, you're saying that higher education in Britain is generally white middle class, and that may be true. I don't know what the statistics are, but you don't know what the statistics are either. And how do you know? What have you read statistics? Have you got statistics that 70% of people go to uni?
That's why they have to have positive discrimination to try and get people who are in maybe the poorer areas of London, try and get them into higher education.
But they have that in all this. There's actually higher education. That's everywhere.
All of this is both a preparation for life in general, for being an active citizen.
Now, folks. But I thought it was rather appropriate to just stop at the point where those two students were quite furiously arguing this case about access to higher education in a corridor. They weren't in a teaching situation. And that brings us back to the point of today. I'm out of time, I'm sorry, but just finally I want to say this is a case study that is bookended by two acute phases of threats to higher education, with dips and ebbs and flows in between. There's lots to celebrate in the 25 years of development and growth on this programme, on this Humanities programme, especially at postgraduate level, which I've not made reference to at all. But there's no room for complacency. We've got lots of good ideas, but making it work requires persistent effort. But above all else, we are in an unstable and unpredictable environment. Last year, surprisingly, and we were surprised, our intake increased by 40%. We were allowed to increase above our target. Politically, that put us in a good position, but operationally, it's a strain. There's a limit to how much you can take extra numbers without really stretching what you can deliver, even when there's extra staff to cover it, which we do have. But the struggle continues. What was and is at stake in the defence of the humanities is the idea that ordinary students who would never qualify for elite institutions, should have access to education that leads outwards, that fosters critical intelligence, that is engaging but also challenging, not a form of entertainment. We want our graduates to have a better understanding of themselves and the world that they live in. We want them to be informed and critical citizens rather than compliant consumers. The belief that this kind of education should be available to all those who can benefit from it goes against the grain of dominant forces today. It goes against the grain of the neoliberal agenda, which, to put it bluntly, is busy creating a two-tier system in which privileged students in elite institutions learn about thinking critically, whereas mass higher education is to limit its horizons to the training of call centre operatives. Thank you.